Welcome to Stories of Brisco and Bradshaw. I would be Bradshaw. That would be your Chickasaw native, your Chickasaw Hall of Famer, Oklahoma's favorite son, Mr. Gerald Brisco. And what a treat we have today. One of the best wrestling books I've certainly ever read. Mr. Brisco told me when you grab this book, you won't be able to put it down. Now, I wasn't able to grab the book because he didn't send me a book free. He sent Mr. Brisco a book free. I had to buy it on my iPad, but he was correct. I could not put it down. It was one of the most interesting things I've ever picked up is Mr. Jon Langmead, who's written the book BALLYHOO, which is about professional wrestling from the start of professional wrestling, which I find absolutely amazing, up to right about when television starts. An incredible book. Jon, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. I'm so happy to be here. I am going to make that free book up to you one of these days. I promise. I promise.
It was worth every penny. And I tell you, I couldn't put it down. Mr. Brisco told me, so when you get this thing, you won't be able to put it down. I could not put it down. I had a delay one day traveling, as you do now these days. And I was kind of happy because I sat there and read the whole book. It was wonderful.
Well,
Jon, after I got the book, I called Jon immediately because I hadn't planned on reading it because I was trying to get through another book for another guest that we had on. So I was trying to get through his book, but I just picked it up and I just opened it up to the epilogue part of it. And I started reading all those bios of all the people that had passed through our business. And I had, as Jon teases me a lot, I've been around since Abe Lincoln, but I knew a lot of those people, and I'd been in dressing room. So I could hardly put it back. Jon called. I said, Jon, I'm reading the greatest book I've ever seen in my life on wrestling. And so we started talking about it. And then after that, I think every time he called me, I was into it. And I told him, I said, hey, Jon, you got to read this book. So you send it to him, but I think he he's a Texan and he has a habit of losing things.
We just
Jon,
got Rocky
welcome
too.
to the show, man, and we're glad to have you here. Jon and I, as you could tell in our pre-conversation here, we're history nuts when it comes to this business here, and we love it. We're not quite as educated as you are on it, but going back, but thanks to books like that you're getting out and some of the other great writers out there that are sharing their knowledge and their research with us, man, it's great. And if you're a fan of wrestling, you got to get this book, BALLYHOO. And what a great name, and we'll go into that. BALLYHOO has the special media that they explained in your book there, so we'll get to that. So welcome aboard here, Jon.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the kind words more than you can imagine, because I really wanted this to be a book that could, people interested in the history would find it readable. People in the business would really be able to identify with some of the stuff in there. And then even just people that just have a general interest in sports or American history might even be able to find something in there too. So it really means a lot to hear that you guys liked it. And
Jon, this is one of you're dealing with some stuff here that's some of the most arcane, esoteric stuff there is. And this is, for those that didn't grow up with the internet like we didn't, it's kind of hard to find this stuff, especially when you're talking about 1880s and you're talking about promoters, and you talk about promoters BSing. Some are working, promoting their crowd, and some workers are promoting themselves. You don't know what's true and what's not. You went through this book. It's one of the most detailed things that I've ever read. How long did it take you to write this book from start to finish?
Yeah, I mean, it probably researching and writing about 8 years, I would say, on and off. And a lot of it was starting and stopping and trying to figure out how to get my hands around a good storyline, because I really wanted this to feel like a story that somebody could read it from beginning to end, and telling the kind of a biography of professional wrestling in that era. And it was just a lot of work. I'll say I've said this in a lot of places, but it's true. I had a lot of good foundations to build on with some of the great guys, Tim Hornbaker and Steve Yohe and Greg Oliver and all these great, and Steve Johnson and all those great guys, Scott Teal, everybody. There's a lot of information out there, but like you said, it's a matter of sort of sorting through it, finding kind of like a through line that you can tell a story in, and then filling in where all the details. And in some cases, we'll talk about this, some of the information you can get through some of the archives that are online, some you got to travel. And there was some traveling around to go in person and try to dig some stuff up too. So, but yeah,
well, I
a lot of work and fun. Best 8 years of my life. A lot of fun.
I can tell you did extensive research on that, but John, I'd like to ask this question to everybody else. We all have a passion for this business. It's crazy business, but as we were talking earlier, the characters in the businesses are so intriguing. It kind of draws you in. What was the tipping point that drew you into this strange business for an educated guy like you? I mean, how did you stumble across it, and was you watching with your parents, or what's your background in getting into this?
Yeah, as a kid, so I grew up in Baltimore, in the early 80s when we lived there. And Baltimore, as I'm sure was a hotbed. Like in the early 80s, a lot of promoters and stuff were kind of fighting to get in there, and wrestling was all over the TV. So we got like Mid-Atlantic, we got AWA, we got World Class. And this was like you said, this was like you might just accidentally tune in at like 11:30 at night, and all of a sudden World Class is on. You're like, what is this? This is great. And so I just got exposed to a lot of it. And then the moment that I remember was somehow I caught Barry Windham and Mike Rotunda when they won the World Tag Team title from Iron Sheik and Nikolai Volkov. And I can't explain it. I don't even gone back to watch the match, but man, like it hooked me. And I was like, that was so awesome. And then I just got really into it. And then I got into.
Would you say you think it was the American versus the Russian and Iranian, or?
It might have been. I'm not sure about that. Maybe it was. I don't know if I was young and smart enough to even pick up on that at the time. You know what I mean? But maybe it was. I just got really into those guys. And then it was Mid-Atlantic. I found Jim Crockett Promotions. We were getting a lot of that. And I just that was like that time when it was awesome. They had the Road Warriors and the Four Horsemen, and they were getting everybody. And I was like, Magnum TA was hot back then. And it was just awesome. I was totally hooked. And we would go my dad would take me when we could go to the matches at the Baltimore Arena. And it's the best, man. I was so hooked on it for a while, for a period. And the magazines, I'll say too. I don't know if you all are fans, but Pro Wrestling Illustrated and Inside Wrestling, I collected and read those things over and over and over and over again. I loved it.
Well, we both grew up in the sticks. We've been John and myself, where you didn't get them much. You were lucky to get more than 2 stations, 3 stations on your TV. So that local drugstore, that when those magazines come in, I know my sister worked at the soda fountain there, and every time the magazines would come in, she'd call me. Hey, Gerald, the magazines are here. That's all she had to say. And I would be down there and tell the owner of the drugstore ran me out of the drugstore.
Yeah, that's right. Because you wouldn't buy them. That's right. Because you wouldn't buy them. You'd read them at the store. That's right. You want to see the top 10. You want to read about a couple of stories. You want to read it before you had to buy it.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't buy it.
I was the same way. My mom, I would get her to take me to the drugstore, and I would, it was that day when they came was like the best. And then every Christmas, getting the Pro Wrestling Illustrated and the big annual at the end that had their year-end awards, and man, it was nothing like it.
Hey, and Abner may have said he hated the apartment wrestling stuff in the back of the magazine, but as a young kid, I highly approved.
Yeah.
I think that was, it was funny. It was gone. That was gone by the time I started reading them. I'm not sure if they still did that now, but if you're interested, one of the first pieces
I'm interested in the apartment wrestling.
Yeah, well, I did. So I
book him, I'll say, he'll show you.
I tracked down all those guys. I tracked down all the writers. And I know some of these names, I don't know who people are going to know them, but obviously Bill Apter, but guys like Craig Peters and Stu Sachs and Steve Farhood and all the Eddie Elner, the guys that wrote all that stuff.
Yeah.
And man, that for a couple years, 10, 20 years, I mean, they were cranking out magazines, man. Yeah. And it's getting to talk to them. And I did a piece for a website where I, kind of told the story of those magazines from about the 60s up until like the late 80s. So much fun. And those guys made it all up from beginning to end. And it's fascinating to me. Fascinating.
It's amazing. The magazines, we had Apter and George Napolitano on. It was just fascinating listening to them talk, how they made literally they made I don't know about book, but they made characters, very similar, like in Japan, the magazines, that's how you got made over there. And in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the times, or especially early 80s, before television was everywhere, magazines were a big way the guys got made.
Yeah. Well, the writers, one of the things they talked about is they started with the photos. So they would sort of get a set of photos, and they'll say, okay, well, what story can we make out of these photos?
It started with a bit of a kernel of truth.
That's right, a kernel of truth. They would make up quotes and all kind of stuff, and they would say, some of the wrestlers would even say, you do me better than I do me, so write whatever you want. So, but
I
yeah,
can't tell you how many times I called after him, thanked him for making me sound better.
that's right. And that was the only way you even knew what was going on in the rest of the country was flipping to the match results to be like, oh, there's wrestling in Portland, there's wrestling here, there's wrestling there. And you never knew.
And I got to tell you, the guys in the dressing room were big and marked for those mags as the people standing in the drugstores waiting to buy one of them too, because they were, you could always find them in the corner of a dressing room somewhere. Somebody would bring one in the dressing room, and of course we'd all have to look through it and see what's going on, because like you say, and John says it's way before the internet, way before. So you wanted to, who's in, where's this guy? You find out, well, he's wrestling in the Northeast or out in the Northwest, out in Oregon or somewhere like that. So when you were was you always creative in writing, or was writing something that came to you, or as you were growing up? My question really is, as you're growing up and you're going to Baltimore Auditorium there, did you ever meet? Were you one of those guys that wanted to meet the guys, and did you meet them, and then how did that go?
I think at that time for me, meeting a professional wrestler, it would have been like meeting like an astronaut, like it just never would have occurred to me to be like, how, they were, it's so, guys like Jimmy Valiant, Boogie Woogie Man, and, obviously Ric Flair, but they were bigger than life, man. I don't know that I would have wanted to meet him in real life and talk to him, but it just, I've talked about this with other people too, but man, because, I play music on the side and stuff. And the idea that like these guys could go from town to town night after night and get 5, 8, 10,000 people. If a band, how few bands can do that, and how few musicians can do that, and like that was their life going
and this is weekly too, and not once a month like a musician or a band.
Totally. And it's just amazing to me the lives they live in, but just what that must have felt like to like get up there and perform for 20, 30, 40 minutes in front of 10,000 people. I mean, I have the utmost respect like for what they did, and I hope I captured some of that in the book, but obviously it's a different era. But part of the whole thrust of the book is like, I don't know that it was really that different when Strangler Lewis was doing it, or Jimlondos. I kind of think it was sort of the same thing. Know what I mean?
And one thing that was really interesting to me before television is how territories ran, how wrestling ran, especially when you're talking about, like a guy like Yusuf Ismail, you talk about a guy I'd love to meet. What a great heel. I mean, that's just the first xenophobic heel, the terrible Turk, it just, it had to be, was it press, the whole promotion for this? Because obviously radio wasn't around that much, but was it all press and just newspapers and finding guys who were agreeable to write about this or wanted to write about this?
Well, I
will let, before you answer that, I'll throw a little kicker into John's question. There's a part in your book where one of the promoters were his profits were going mostly to the newspaper people, and a lot of the newspaper people got busted. And then when the word got out to this one guy was getting kickbacks, all the newspapers started researching who was doing the wrestling and found out they. And so a bunch of wrestling writers actually got fired over the business, right?
Yeah, that was towards it in Los Angeles in like the early 1940s. There was a big kind of expose around the Darrow brothers and how much they were paying. Athletic commissioners and reporters, and I think I suspect it probably happened in a lot of sports. I don't know if wrestling was completely unique in that respect, but they got, I think that there's a lot of wrestling promoters are given a lot of leeway, I think sometimes, you know what I mean, to get away with certain things and build the business in a certain way. And I think there's probably different reasons for that. But yeah, I think that getting the press involved, and in the case of Yusuf Ismail, one of the things I think I tried to pull out was this guy named William Brady, who was a theater promoter, and that and boxing, there was all kind of cross stuff going on, cross collaboration with boxing and wrestling at the time. But he latched on to Yusuf Ismail, but applied all of the same kind of concepts that he would use to draw people to a theater to, promote Ismail, and it really worked. But the thing that really intrigues me about him too is I don't know how much he was in on it. You know what I mean? It's not clear that he spoke English, and I wonder what it felt like for him to get in the ring and have 20, 12,000 people trying to kill him. You know what I mean? And
he was the first. He was the first great heel, wasn't he?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think so. I think it may have been a little unintentional. I think one of the first real
Now
intentional.
this is Ivan the Terrible, so the Fed, right?
This is Yusuf Ismail, who was really the first of like the Terrible Turks. He came around.
Terrible Turk,
like
yeah.
the early 1880s around or so. He came. This is before.
He wasn't even a Turk, though. What was he?
He wasn't. He was. I'm going to get this wrong. I forget exactly where he's from, but he wasn't Turkish. But
I'm gonna get it wrong. But
that way.
For some reason, I think he was come from like the former Soviet Union type states. The Eastern Europe, like somewhere around Poland, I believe, is where it was from.
That's exactly right. I don't want to get it wrong, but yeah. And when he came to the country, Brady dressed him up in this, headgear and robes and all this flowing stuff, and told all these stories, flowing clothes, and told all these outrageous stories about him. And I think that was really one of the jumping off points of, if not the first heel, the first like really contrasting with these guys that were like in wool tights and bare chests and things like that, right? Like creating like this really colorful character that'll draw people to the arena. And then I think the promoters just built on it and built on it from there.
And he drew great crowds, right?
For a period of time, yeah. And he was going into Cleveland and Chicago and wrestling with like Strangler Lewis, the original Strangler Lewis, Evan Lewis. Huge crowds. And then on his tour, when he was finished, he died sailing back from my understanding. Now, you never know how much of this stuff is true, but from what I've read, he was going to use up some of the money to start like a restaurant back in his home country, and he died on the way in a really famous shipwreck that made a ton of headlines. But what was even interesting about that is the stories that have survived about what happened to him is that, he was stabbing people as he fought his way off the ship to get into it, into the lifeboat so he could survive, and that he ended up dying because his gold, he was so weighed down with gold it dragged him down to the bottom. None of that's true.
Which, by the way, John, the guy dies. I mean, the guy legitimately dies, and wrestling promoters are still promoting the character that the reason he died was because he was stabbing people trying to get in the lifeboat, and he sunk because he brought all his gold with him and wouldn't let it go.
And I feel like that story kind of says it all in a lot of ways, about the business, but
it's all business.
It's all business. And, I think what's great too, is I've heard other stories of in the 70s when I forget the guy, I'm not going to remember the guy's name, but you'll probably remember, but he was a big heel down in Florida and he died in a plane crash. And there were stories of like when they announced
Bobby Shane.
And my understanding is when they announced it at the arena that he died, everybody cheered. And I love it. It's hilarious. It's awful, but it's hilarious, So
that's where Lawler got his crown.
Probably the way he would have wanted it. That's probably how he would have wanted to have been remembered,
That's where Lawler got his crown.
That's right. I remember
he never gave it back to him because Bobby passed away in the plane crash.
Bobby died.
Bobby died. Lawler was cheering.
I remember I was at one of these fan fests, and they had like a breakfast to celebrate Ole Anderson, and they rolled him out. And he was so old and he was hunched over and it wasn't clear he could hear. Everybody starts booing him, and it's a joke, it's like 60, 100 people. They're booing Ole and he's in his wheelchair and he just looks up and he gives everybody the finger. And it was so funny. Like, that's probably exactly what he wanted to hear, I love that.
When Heenan, as he got older, what you hated this about Bobby, he lost his voice, which is the one thing that, because I always say when they want to ask who's the greatest commentator, they're not asking who's the greatest commentator is. They're asking who's the best behind Heenan, because Heenan was better than everybody else. And you hate a guy like that, lost his voice. And at the end, it's what he'd do. He'd flip people off just to be a heel. You'd see him at the table, he'd flip you off.
I listen to that stuff now, and there's obviously lots of great announcers, but Heenan and those guys, and I just think, how did they sit there and make this stuff on the spot and just improvise like that?
That's right, on the spot, because they didn't have cards, they had nothing. Yeah. They had just them. It was he and Gorilla were the best team, I think, of all time.
Just the best. And so I'll say, to tie it back to the book, I'll say, so my interest came, I think, from my love of all that stuff and just the show business of it in a lot of ways, but really kind of trying to think about like, where did this thing even come from? Because it's so strange to me that it even exists. Right. We even have a thing called pro wrestling that's sort of this, is it fake? Is it real? Like, what's going on here with all these incredibly talented people who are in it? And it gets so little respect, but it's like, how did this thing come to be? So that was really the kind of question at the core of the book.
And
Yeah, we're the most secretive business in the world, and you know the archives on us because our audience was, well, it wasn't really, as you say, really small, but it was huge, but it was kind of a hidden audience. And the people who wrote about it were so few that it, and their work seemed like it was discarded there, but there were so many characters there. But you through all of your book, the common thread in this, in your book, your outstanding book is Jack Curley, was a fascinating character who was the guy, folks. He was the Vincent Kennedy McMahon before Vincent Kennedy McMahon was even a spark in the old man's eyes there. So tell us a little bit how you narrowed it down through all the intriguing characters to Jack Curley.
Yeah, so I kind of knew I wanted to write about that the trial that took place in 1936 or 37, whatever year it was, when Dick Schickett happens at the end of the book, but he was sued by all the promoters for going off script, basically. So I knew I wanted to write about that.
And John, just to add a little granularity for those who watch, that was over Dan O'Mahony, right?
That's right. So
Yeah.
right, Dick Schickett, for people who don't know, was an aging wrestler that was scheduled to wrestle Dan O'Mahony, who had been sort of handpicked to be the world champion of wrestling. And Schickett went off script one night in Madison Square Garden and beat O'Mahony in the middle of the ring and won the title. And then put the title up for sale, essentially. So the promoters got together and sued him. And it was just this kind of like, you can't make this stuff up kind of thing, of like this collision of like, the truth and fantasy and all this stuff. So I knew I really wanted to write about that. And there were a couple other spots. I knew I wanted to write about Gus Sonnenberg, and I knew I wanted to write about Hackenschmidt, Gotch, and all that stuff. So Curley was the name that just kept coming up. He had a hand, everywhere you look in wrestling in the early years, he's there one way or another. So I think I eventually landed that I could just use him as sort of this jumping off point to talk about all of these guys, Billy Sandow and Paul Bowser in Boston, and all the great wrestlers, Joe Stecker and
Toots Mont.
Toots Mont, Jack Pfeffer. I knew I wanted to get in there, who I'm sure we'll talk about. But and Curley was sort of like the center of the hurricane in a lot of ways. I think he held the wrestling business together. He wasn't always the guy that picked the winners and losers necessarily, but he was the guy that held everybody and kept it from going off the rails. And after he dies in 1937, wrestling kind of plateaus for a long period of time, because I just think the business, people lost interest in it. People were lost interest because he was such a big figure, and then he was gone and things like that. So I think that really hurt the business for a long period of time.
What amazed me was the self-sabotage in the business back then, which you still see some of it now. But that lawsuit in 1937 was one of the dumbest things ever. I mean, there's no way to win that on either side. You have to expose the business. But it's like when I broke in the business, they're going, oh, you always got to protect the business. One thing your book makes very clear is that every week the business was exposed in some way.
Everywhere.
I mean, there's
everywhere in the country. Yeah.
If you're alive and not under a rock, the business is a work, because it's been exposed since the 1880s. I didn't realize the amount of exposés that had happened year after year, decade after decade in the business.
Well, yeah, and that's one of, we talked a little bit about this when we were first getting started, but the expose that Jack Pfeffer does in 1933, which gets a lot of attention, where he went to the New York press and told everybody what was going on. It was kind of like that. People were kind of like, they already knew, everybody sort of knew that was the case. So it sort of felt strange. I think when he did it, I think what hurt it was just, it felt like the promoters and everybody were laughing at the fans. I think it showed a level of sort of disrespect for people, and they got sick of it from that perspective. But what I think is funny about wrestling is, I mean, I remember in, 1985, 1986, like 2020 did an expose, like, oh, wrestling's fake. It's like, of course wrestling's fake, but like, it's not either. You know what I mean? And that's what I love about it, is it's like, it is and it isn't. And it's this really exists in this strange kind of netherworld that I
always thought it was
kind of like,
I've always thought it was kind of like Houdini's milk can trick.
Yeah.
You know he's not going to drown in there, but there's also a chance he could. Like when he's upside down in a straitjacket hanging over the Hudson River. He's going to get out, but there's always a chance that maybe he doesn't. So there's a trick. You don't know exactly what it is, and you don't really care. You just want to be entertained. And I think that's the way most people think about it. So people start saying, well, we're going to expose wrestling back in the 1890s, even. People are like, don't really care.
Well, right. I think, right. And I think it just sapped the fun out of it for people. I think people enjoyed going. And I do think that in some cases, you know, and I would love to even know if this was the case in the 70s. I think I've heard other people say this too. It's like every match that's fake except for the one they came to see. And then you know what I mean? So I think there's an element of that. And I think just being able to get wrapped up in it, you know, is important. But I also think at the time in the 10s and 20s and 30s, it wasn't clear how much other sports were not rigged sometimes.
You know, that's a great point you're making there. You know, the sock scandal, black sock scandal. You know, all the sports were going through scandals at the same time that the wrestling was ballooning.
Yeah, right. And Jerry, they talk about Primo Carnera may have never had a legitimate fight.
Yeah, boxing was outlawed all over the country.
Yeah, it's not like boxing to this day. You don't question sometimes.
Yeah.
Totally. And I mean, I think I'm interested too. I mean, I love sports, but you know, to the degree that we believe in it is interesting to me too. And I often wonder as gambling comes more into play and, you know, some of that stuff comes back, is there going to be scandals in some of the big sports, and what will that do to the credibility of other sports and things like that? So I don't know, but you see that over and over again in the 10s and 20s.
And that's your book too. That the gambling, and not only in was really predominant wrestling too, which I found kind of interesting too. Not only in the early days of football and the other sport, baseball, but wrestling had its share, and it was kind of controlled by the gamblers to a certain point too. But I find intriguing in your book that you know, and as an old timer and John as a historian to our business, you know, well, back in these days it was a shoot. But even in your book, when we go way back to the beginnings of it, you know, there's traces of the working part of it coming in, and there's really never a defining time or match that said this was a shoot and this was a work. So, you know, even in the gotcha, you know, well, you know. You don't know where his matches were worked or shoot sometimes, you know, reading about them. Did you find that in your research too?
For sure. And that's the point I think I really wanted to make, because I think too is it's like, what's the difference? So if you think about like the 1911 Gotch Hackenschmidt match, you know, Hackenschmidt goes in there with like a blown out knee. Yeah. You know, he clearly isn't going to win. He knows it too, but he felt like he had to go in there to sort of, because he'd have ruined it. You know, there's 30,000 people out there. What's he going to do? But, you know, he in one part of his mind, he's terrified Gotch is really going to hurt him. So it's legitimate in that respect. And Gotch might have. And maybe he could have said to Gotch, hey, let's make it look good. You know, let's go 45 minutes. Let's, you know, give me a chance here. But then if you were to do that, was Hackenschmidt going to decide, you know, get a hold of Gotch and maybe he can win somehow, you know? So I think that line of like, what is a work? What is a shoot? Like, and it's not always such a clear, bright line all the time, you know?
Okay. So I'm a Mark. I'm going to ask the question. Gotch and Hackenschmidt, the first one, was it a shoot?
I think so. I mean, I kind of think so for sure. I think because, you know, that's what they say. You can tell the shoot. And I think there's a quote about the 1911 match. If it had been a fake, it would have been more exciting. You know, I think it probably was a shoot. You know, they were scratching each other and gouging each other and doing stuff like that. So probably.
And Gotch apparently was telling him during it, he goes, over here, we don't throw matches. Something to that effect. He was taunting him during it that this is legit and I'm going to beat you.
But, you know, and that's another.
That could be part of the work too. You know,
that's the thing. And that's what I love about wrestling. And I still to this day, is you never, ever, ever know where the work ends and the shoot begins ever, you know? And so I think with all that stuff, you have to keep a grain of salt. And that's why I tried in the book, never, ever to land one way or the other, because I just don't think you can know for sure. And does it really matter? Really? I don't know. Does it matter? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, that's the big deal about Londos was, hey, if you want to shoot, we'll do it in the gym, but never in front of people. You know, because he didn't think it'd be entertaining.
Right. He wanted to make money. That was his goal, not wins and losses, you know.
Londos was a special character too, John, because he was one of these guys. He was kind of a forerunner to really bring the work part out and the entertainment out in the open, because he knew that the wrestling was boring, and he knew that two wrestlers from the Olympics couldn't go out there and draw 20,000, 30,000 people. but he also knew if he threw a little entertainment in there that he could get the interest going, and the crowd would multiply, which they did. So to me, Londos was really the guy that kind of the pioneer, kind of the first guy that kind of admitted, guys, we got to have entertainment in our business or we'll die.
I do tend to think, I completely agree with you. I do tend to think that some of those guys had different elements of that in their match. Like there's Theobald Bauer is one of the guys that comes up early in the book. He wrestles William Muldoon, and he gets up at one point and he faces the crowd and wipes his brow off, and Muldoon picks him up. Like was that
I thought
probably.
Layfield, he does a Layfield.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It probably was, and I think there's a match with Stanislaus Zabisco and Frank Gotch where Stanislaus, they shake hands, and then Gotch takes him down and pins him. Probably it worked. I don't know. Maybe. I think so, but who knows?
What happened to William Muldoon? I mean, he became a curmudgeon later in life.
Oh wow, what a character he was too. I mean, he was a guy that just he was a champion wrestler. Then he got head of the New York Athletic Commission, and he brought all these rules in to kind of kill the sport. What happened on that, John?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. There's actually a biography that's coming out on him by a guy named Scott Beekman. So everybody should be on the lookout for that. But that's coming before too much longer. But yeah, I don't know. Muldoon's an interesting figure. I think he is a real curmudgeon. I think for different periods of time, I went back and forth on him. I thought, man, what a hypocrite. Here he is. He kind of performs in this work sport all these years. And then when he gets to run it, he kind of puts all these rules in place. It takes all the fun out of it. But, another way of looking at him, though, is that he really he tried, I think, to put some air of legitimacy around it in some respect to maybe help it, because it's not always clear that wrestling would have survived after, it has these peaks and valleys. But at the end of 1919, 1920, it had really gone out of favor. Maybe he went, by putting these rules around it, people could take it just seriously enough that they could go to the match and really enjoy it. If it had gone the other direction and just been unregulated, maybe it would have become like this real flea circusy kind of thing, and it never would have gotten to where it was. I don't know, but I think there's multiple ways to take him, but mostly I think he's like a lot of old guys that they look back and they're like, oh, I was better when I was young.
That's an interesting take. I didn't think about that. But William Muldoon, who's in your book, you wrote such a great job about chronicling. He was for those that don't know, was a worker, and then he got head of the commission and said it's got to be a shoot, basically. And so, and what you're saying is maybe he was doing that kind of wink, wink, underhand to say, I'm gonna save the business. You guys got to make it look like a shoot.
It's I don't know. And I think the wrestlers were working him probably in some ways for sure, and I think he really helped with boxing in a lot of ways. Boxing may have just become so unbelievably corrupt, but he tried to put certain, guardrails around boxing that helped it stay somewhat legitimate. We might have lost it, it could have died in the early 20s. You just don't know with this stuff, but.
And boxing was so interesting to me. In your book, you chronicle it so well done that boxing was banned in a lot of places. So all you had was professional wrestling. So wrestling had this green field that, because boxing was banned in so many places before rules came along to change, unlimited amount of rounds and things like that.
Yeah, and I think too, to that, and I don't know if I say this in the book, but I think partially why boxing was banned is because it was just so violent. And I think that people thought it was a real kind of scourge sometimes. And it drew a bad element, gambling and things like that. I think maybe wrestling tried to get away from the overt violence as much, maybe to help keep it from getting regulated too much. You don't see there's some, and I'm sure you guys know too, but there's examples early on where such and such shooter killed somebody accidentally, or somebody died in the ring, or things like that. But I think they probably tried to avoid some of the real bloody violence, maybe to keep it from getting regulated the same way boxing was.
So other than killing people, they tried to avoid others.
I tend to think so. Though you read about some of those Gotch and Jenkins matches, man, in like 1906, 1907. I mean, they sound like they were bloody messes, and that they were all over the ring. So I don't, again, were they real or not? I don't know. Were they blading? I don't know. Maybe they were. Who knows?
Yeah, and you also mentioned the pig bladder that the guys would use for blood back then, back before the 1900. Explain that.
So, yeah, I mean, the most famous example is there was and I write about this in the book, is there was a ring of gamblers basically who would draw, people looking to lose a lot of money to these private sporting events, boxing matches, wrestling matches, but there were other ones too, races, horse races, things like that. And the event would basically always end the same way, that one of the two competitors, who sort of was this sure thing that everybody had put their money on, would bite into this bladder of blood basically that they had hidden in their mouth, and this blood would start coming out of their mouth and they'd fall down dead in the ring. And at that point, everybody gets so worked up because you're in.
Wait. They'd actually work being dead.
They'd work being dead. No, absolutely. And so at that point, a doctor would come in the ring who was part of the scam, declare this person dead. And everybody in the house would start to freak out because they're like, you're in the middle now. They're going to have to call the police and all this stuff. So they'd go kind of running out of the house. And in the confusion, the money that was sort of being bet would all sort of land with this gang, the Mabray gang. And so, they never got their money back. There were people who lost just gigantic amounts of money. I mean, you see some of this stuff if you watch like The Sting, that old, Paul Newman movie. You see some of that stuff in there of like these just gamblers, and that they would go and bet huge amounts of money on card games or whatever. But in this case, it was sporting events. And it was a big part. But what's interesting about that, and that would carry into the ring too, because sometimes you would get early wrestlers who would carry pig bladders and stuff in their mouth and do blood. This is in like the early 1900s. But
it's just amazing. They would fake being dead, actually dying in the ring.
Exactly.
That's so freaking nuts.
Now think about it, a small room probably with like 30 people packed into it in a makeshift wrestling ring in the middle. It's amazing. It was such an outlaw, wild sport. All sports really were back in those days, but yeah, wrestling and boxing in particular.
I never did put it together until I started reading your book about, all the sports and what they were going through. And we discussed it briefly, was the gambling part. And all sports were going through that at the time. And it's so amazing that wrestling of all of them kind of rose above them all during this time period. It was the biggest work of them all. Or was it?
Well, I think no, right? Or was it? And I think that's largely, to jump back to Jack Curley, I think that's the power of probably where the promoters came in, is they could kind of work the local regulations, work the athletic commissions, and give this thing an air of legitimacy. And they started being able to kind of put it on. They found, like you said, with these early guys found ways to make these matches entertaining for people, and they were selling out Madison Square Garden every other week. And this is in the 1917, 1918, these guys. And so I just think it's, and I think that one of the things, one of my pretexts of the book is like, I'm not sure that if you went to see Ed Lewis and Vladik Zbyszko wrestle in 1917, that would kind of look a lot like a match in 1985, 1986. You probably react in the same way in a lot of cases and get just as work. So,
interesting. Because the thought is, and I agree with you, the thought is that these matches were 3-4 hours and they were just sitting on the mat forever, which at times matches like that happen, but at times today matches happen that are real boring too. So it's not, it's not indicative just of the time that a match can be not entertaining. But it's interesting you say.
Also, John, going along with that, the length of the matches, they tried to put a time limit on the matches early on, but it just seemed like it never did stick, because I read in your book, John, where they put time limits on them, but then, there were no winners, so they would continue to wrestle until there was a winner, because the crowd wouldn't disperse until they saw a winner.
Yeah, there's some matches like that. There's a famous sort of 5-hour match with Joe Stecker and Ed Lewis, and that's kind of like that's a big touchstone match, but I went however long, 5.5, 6 hours. And at a certain point, the people drive their cars down and they have their headlights on the ring.
Put the headlights on, right?
They won't let the wrestlers finish the match. And I've talked a lot with other historians about this match, particularly like Steve Yohe, who did a lot of research on Ed Lewis. And you just try to imagine what is going through. I mean, what is going through Joe Stecker and Ed Lewis's match, where they're like, please, God, just let us get out of this ring. You know what I mean?
Please, yeah.
For 6 hours.
Hey, when you're in a long match, a lot of time, I know Mr. Briscoe's brother Jack would break it down into quarters, from what I've been told, 15-minute, matches at a time, 4 15-minute matches. When you're at 5 hours, you're like an hour and 15. Go, hey, I only got 4 hours left. I'm almost there.
Well, and it's not clear to me. The thing that's interesting about that match is how they let that happen, because did they just not agree on who was going to be the winner? Could
Right.
neither of them, could neither of them overcome the other one
At some
somehow?
point, I'm doing a job and I'm going to blame the
Yeah.
referee. Yeah, about 3 hour mark, I'm like, dude, if you're not going down, I am. You're going to cover me.
No, right.
And
So
then speaking of the referee, that's what happened. The referees, poor referees, they were mostly just about every night run out of town on a railroad car, right?
yeah, that's right. And I think, there was fears too if, would the athletic commission ban wrestling, after that, because it was such a debacle and things like that. So I think the promoters started to figure out we got to get more control over this and somehow convince these guys that it makes sense to work together and that we can all make more money if we kind of work together on a more regular basis. But yeah, I think that match was a real kind of watershed. But like you said, there was so much wrestling going on all the time. Not all the matches were like that. And you see, I always think a guy I think a lot about is Nikolai Volkov and even Kevin Sullivan, who just died. Like, what's going through their head where they're playing these characters and everybody's booing you and everybody hates you and throwing garbage at you. But that happened back then too with some of these guys. The fans reacted just the same way.
I want to ask you, I know I'm jumping around everywhere, but I'm so interested in all of it. I got so many different things I want to talk to you about. But the Strangler Lewis and Jimlondos match, when they finally met up, Londos specifically took out a lot of the high flying, and the newspapers reported that that match was a shoot, which obviously it wasn't. Londos is very particular about he doesn't shoot in the ring, he shoots in the gym. He wants to entertain people. I guess it's a question of one of two things. Was Londos trying to make it look like a shoot by taking out the high flying to show the importance of the match, or was he worried that Strangler Lewis might double cross him?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that my suspicion, and Steve Johnson might correct me if people don't know who Steve Johnson is, but he's working on a book and he's the resident Londos expert.
Another wonderful book, by the way. I wrote the forward for it. I was really happy to do that because I'm a big fan of Jimlondos, and Steve does a wonderful job as well. As just
you can buy it now on Amazon. But I think that I think Strangler was probably fully bought in. I suspect he was fully compensated, and he was probably compensated very well for taking that loss to Londos, and that's one of the few clean losses that he ever, I think, gave to Londos. And I think both of them go in there in their bare feet.
It was definitely the first.
Right. He didn't do it very often. Apparently, Londos and Lewis had quite a lot of heat. I think legitimate heat backstage with each other. But I just think the money probably I think Lewis probably needed the payday to a certain degree, and it was probably a heck of a lot of money, and he was willing to just do the job for Londos. But I think that this is stuff, Steve Yohe talks about it too, is they were under so much pressure from the Chicago Athletic Commission to not make that thing look fake, because I think Chicago is one of the tougher athletic commissions, and they would ban wrestling if they got a hint that something was maybe out of order. So I think they tried to make that match look as good as they possibly could. So
the newspapers reports after it all said wrestling may be a show that was real. They
right.
over like it was.
Right. Yeah,
one of the
and again, it goes
ever.
back to this: what the heck is real, and what's two talented wrestlers could make a work look like a shoot.
Right.
For sure.
One thing you wrote in your book, it was such a wonderful way that you put it, was about Wayne Munn and Stanislaus Sabisco. You put about the sport, said this is not just like the first time a guy does a job for somebody in a working environment, but it's the first time you actually create a character completely out of thin air, that the whole character is not real, the whole facade is not real, and the championship therefore is not real either with Wayne Munn. It was just a great way to put about this, like, is this even a sport at that point? And describe a little bit what you were writing about.
Yeah, so for
one of the big first screw jobs for those that don't know in 1925.
Yeah, so for people who don't know, so Wayne Munn was a college football player and a big guy. I'm 6'7". He big guy, and he was brought into professional wrestling. Legitimate athlete. He had a legitimate athletic background, but brought in by Billy Sandow, who was a promoter who was most famous for managing Ed Lewis, Strangler Lewis. But Strangler Lewis had kind of run the course. He'd been champion for a couple of years. People were kind of sick of seeing him. They'd seen the act. So Sandow tried to move the belt onto Wayne Munn. Here is his first really manufactured from whole cloth heavyweight champion and a guy that, you know, probably couldn't really defend himself in the ring. But Sandow felt like he had built enough of a kind of protective, you know, system around Wayne Munn, where he had wrestlers who through different means and you know, Gerald, I don't know if you've heard of this stuff, but like where they would have wrestlers like sign over the deed to their house that like if they didn't follow the script, you know, these promoters would come after them. So Sandow, I think for sure was involved in some of that. And so he felt like he had enough cooperative guys on his roster that he could have Wayne Munn have a title run and hold on to it. So they moved the belt onto Wayne Munn in this great match, you know, big, clearly a work. But eventually on this circuit, he comes across Stanislaus Zbyszko.
Hey, and by the way, let me cut you off. This was like the Road Warriors of the 1920s. I mean, you didn't have squash jobs back then, but he was legitimately squashing people. You know, matches were going 45 minutes an hour. He's beating people in minutes. You know, for one, not to expose himself, but also to build up this incredible persona that he's dominating people.
And people love it. You know, the audiences love it and they love him. And so he, in one of his matches, he goes to wrestle Stanislaus Zbyszko, who, you know, was now in his maybe early 50s, late 40s, former world champion a couple times, great legitimate wrestler. And they wrestle in Philadelphia in a match that should have just gone according to script. You know, Wayne Munn should have squashed him, you know, and everybody would have gone home happy. But, you know, at some point Stanislaus decides, you know, he's not going to do it. And it's still not clear why exactly he did that, but he humiliates Munn, you know, and then Wayne Munn never had a chance. But what's interesting to me about that, so he beats him in 2 straight falls, sends him back to the dressing room, you know, in humiliation. But what's interesting about that is that after the match, to me, everybody in the Wayne Munn circle feeds these stories into the paper. You know, he has appendicitis, he was sick, you know, he goes into the ring, he was practically on his deathbed. Is any of it true? I don't know. Apparently he's operated on for appendicitis a couple of days later. Is that a work? I don't know. Did they plant that story? I don't know. We don't have the hospital records. I suspect that he was probably well, in perfectly fine health, and I think Stanislaus Zbyszko just completely humiliated him, and it threw the whole business for a loop for a period of time. Because again, the promoters weren't sure they really had a grasp on everything the way they thought they did.
And who was it that you think was behind it?
Jack Curley. So Jack Curley takes credit for it later on. he claims that he paid Stanislaus Zbyszko and met him in the dressing room.
That's probably what happened, right? Because of what the events that followed.
Probably. So what it seems happened, at least according to Jack Curley, is that, you know, he said to Stanislaus, look, if you get a hold of the world championship, you know, I'll guarantee you X amount of dollars, you know, and that he was able to then book him straight into a match with Joester, where Stanislaus drops the belt back to Joester and he gets paid, you know, this exact amount of money for the match in St. Louis. You know, and then because that was what they had wanted all along. They were fighting, and this is something I talk a lot about in the book, but we haven't talked much about it. But the world championship was just essential back then. Having that world title and having control of it, you know, was critical to these.
Which world title? You had several of them back there, though. Right?
You did, yeah. But they tried to kind of make it sort of like through the Gotch line. You know, they tried to tie stuff back to Frank Gotch and this unified heavyweight championship. Even though right at the time there was still world championships, they would have, you know, the state champion of this, or other guys would be out promoting themselves. But there was one generally agreed upon world heavyweight championship that people focused on. And when Ed Lewis took it over for a period of time, and then the Wayne Munn split, and there's people who track all of this stuff through the newspapers. Then you get this sort of split in the world title, which Jimlondos ends up unifying again a couple of years later.
And again, self-sabotage. I mean, this really hurt the wrestling business at this point.
You know, I think it did. I think they were still slowly building it back up. By 3 or 4 years later, you get Gus Sonnenberg. But see, now what I would argue, I'm not sure if it hurt the business, because I think in some ways Wayne Munn is like the prototype for what came later. You know, you get Gus Sonnenberg in 19.
Right, correct. Yeah.
I mean, Gus Sonnenberg was as famous as you can get as an athlete or as an entertainer. I mean, he, for 2 or so years, he was making tons of money. And then and then now Jimlondos was a legitimate athlete, no doubt about that. But still, you know, it was clearly a work at that point, you know, and then it really kind of gets out of control with some of the guys who come in and hold the championship after.
But what caused the after effect of this was you wanted Wayne Munn versus Strangler Lewis. That was the plan, right? And they're going to try to break the attendance record. They thought they could take business to a whole new level. Basically, they brought Wayne Munn in and got this really good looking guy, legit athlete, 6'7" monster. You know, they Goldberged him, they had him squashing everybody, and then all of a sudden now you've got all this cachet and interest in him. Well, you didn't plan on the old bastard like Stanislav Zbyszko taking the title off of him. If it hadn't happened, it might have worked, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I think it probably would have worked. I mean, they ended up drawing a good crowd. They had their match. They ended up having their match again with Ed Lewis, and I think again, what's interesting about that time is Billy Sandow again, who was acting as everybody's manager. He was Wayne Munn's manager, and Ed Lewis's manager, and they tried to keep that secret, but he was basically had his hands in everything. He goes out of his way in the newspapers to explain why Wayne Munn didn't really lose. He should have been, Stanislaus should have been disqualified or this reason or that reason. And really Wayne Munn's still the champion. So it's so, and there were even fans at the time that thought this was some sort of elaborate double work. You know what I mean? That somehow Sandow had planned for Stanislaus Zbyszko to shoot on him, So
wait a minute. Fans thinking something's a double work. Stop it.
No, I know. And I think that's so interesting because I think people nowadays think that the smart fan is modern, but there were smart fans just as well back in the 1910s and 20s, and people that they solely liked wrestling, I think, because they were trying to see through what was going on.
I'm just glad there was a screw job that Mr. Brisco wasn't involved in.
Now, is that the bite? Is that the mysterious bite match?
So the bite match is a little later. That's Ed Lewis and was it Henri de Glane was the guy's name. They were up in Montreal.
Yeah, Glane.
Another famous, match we can go.
Before we get to that, I got to ask you now. Wayne Munn, was he the guy with the long legs that did the leg scissors, the body scissors?
That was Joe Stecker. Joe Stecker was that guy.
Oh, Joe Stecker. I was reading there where I thought it very interesting that he had the body scissors. That was before Ed Strangler Lewis becomes Strangler. Then as he had that body scissor, they went and developed Ed Lewis with the but Ed wasn't the first one to squeeze the mannequin, right? There was an Ed one. Tell us about that.
I think, and hopefully I don't get any of this wrong. I feel like Steve and Yoey and these guys will kill me if I get some of these facts wrong. But I think that I think a lot of that was
the heck with them. They're not here. Make
that's
up
right. That's right. You guys will protect me.
Yeah.
This is your show. We'll have them on it.
So I think that was happening simultaneously. I think that Stecker and Lewis were kind of coming up together, and so with Vladik Zbyszko and some of those guys were coming along.
They were building holds. They were building finishing holds at that time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And they're kind of the second generation right after Frank Gotch. But Gotch has his spinning toe hold, which was a famous.
Yeah. And the spinning toe hold. You and I talked about that as I was reading. I think your first chapter. Is that the first origin of the funk spinning toe hold? It wasn't a spin or anything like that, but it's a variation of it.
One of the highlights of my life is texting with you about the spinning toe hold. Believe me, that was sort of a highlight of my life. I'll take with me for the rest of my life. But I think it wasn't quite as showy. I think Terry Funk's by then, they were doing it much more theatrically. He spun around, and he was really like, it's awesome, But I think Frank Gotch's was probably closer to like a legitimate wrestling hold, where he would sort of get the guy's leg in sort of an anchor position and then bend his foot. It probably didn't look like quite as much as Terry Funk's, but so I think these guys start getting associated with finishing holds. So then you get Joe Stecker's body scissors, and you get Ed Lewis's headlock, you get like Jimlondos's airplane spin. And again, I think it's ways that the fans get clued in when to cheer. It's like, oh, awesome, the finishing hold's happening. He's never going to get out of that. And it was like ways for people to argue about, you'd see stuff in the newspaper where they're like, we're going to the headlock's too dangerous. He's putting people in the hospital. We're banning it, so then they'd have matches where he can't use the headlock or stuff like that. I mean, it's just, again, stuff you see
Which, by the way, Jimlondos airplane spin.
That's
the most bogus finish of all time. And
except the spinning toe hold.
You're the period
the spinning toe hold's not, John, because you're from Texas.
Right, maybe it's a tie.
Well, I think they say too the headlock, Ed Lewis's headlock, which was a little. It was more to it than just the headlock. But and from what I understand, talking with people, like you would never, ever, ever let somebody. You'd never give away sort of your back position to somebody.
By the way, Bruce Prichard invented the headlock.
And the spinning toe hold. I I found some old tapes on YouTube of, I guess they're not tapes, we're used to calling it tapes, on videos on YouTube of Strangler Lewis, and the headlock was it's just a headlock. It's really, he got it built up to be this big thing, but he would literally off the lockup grab the headlock and just kind of take the guy over and land on top of him, and then just start working the headlock. It wasn't that great. It was.
It works.
So the origination of that, though, John, where did that come from? Was that who was Edwin Lewis?
So Ed Lewis. Edward Lewis. Yeah, he was a young wrestler from Wisconsin. Like a lot of guys. I mean, it was a good way to make money back then. If you were a big, strapping dude, wrestling was a way to make money. And, people would slowly get built up on the local circuit or whatever. They'd work these variety houses or burlesque shows, things like that, where they'd have wrestling matches. Eventually, he came to the attention of Billy Sandow, who was a promoter at the time. And, I think it was through Sandow. Sandow was the one who called him Strangler. I think Sandow was the one who helped him develop the headlock. And just, I think what he helped with was getting reporters to write about him, I think. And the way they did that is like, oh, Lewis's opponent ended up in the hospital tonight. The Strangler put somebody in the hospital again. They're crushing people's heads. This thing is too dangerous. So it was this, again, that's where the BALLYHOO comes
And they go around with the press with that mannequin with that thing in it, right?
That's right. And Lewis, there's this fantastic quote. Ed Lewis actually wrote an autobiography.
Now, have you said you saw it? It's unpublished, right? Have you seen the transcript of it?
I do. Yeah, I was able to get a copy. There's a couple floating around out there, and I was able. And for me, it was kind of one of the gold mines of getting a hold of this. But he writes, a lot of detail there about how old wrestlers. I don't know if they still did this in the 70s, but where they could fake doctors out. They would show up at the hospital, and say, I was in a match tonight, got these headaches, I've got this, my ears are ringing, this, and the doctor's no way for them to know. And they'd spend the night in the hospital, and then the doctor would back it up, and they'd say, oh yeah, so, but then you see that, the last thing I'll say, you see that again in the 1980s with Andy Kaufman, where he's with his neck brace.
So Andy Kaufman spent a whole weekend in the hospital.
He wore that neck brace everywhere.
Yeah, he worked the entire hospital, spent the whole weekend in a hospital bed. Yeah,
I mean, that kind of commitment, you don't think you see that commitment as much anymore nowadays.
I just thought Andy Kaufman to me is one of the greatest stories, because we had Jerry Jarrett on here, and he was telling us that the stuff with Andy Kaufman when he first started was a shoot with the women. He literally would get out there with, that's a pretty big risk. There's some tough women in Tennessee. He could have lost very easily.
That's for sure. So that stuff absolutely was a for sure. And that he took that risk getting in there with the women. I'm always interested though too, is how he wasn't sure if he was going to get sued or something like that if he hurt somebody. But he took that chance. He did do that. Those matches.
He did. He took some massive chances. But you know how it is when you're a heel. If you lose to a woman, so what? You claim that she cheated. It's
that's right. That's right. He'd have found a way to talk his way out of it.
Wayne Munn was interesting to me. I always find that so interesting. Here's a guy who just kind of came along and kind of got stuck into a business that I say he didn't belong. He just got double crossed by Stanislaus Zbyszko. If not for that, it probably would have worked. He ended up being a boxer. It was, I think, maybe or maybe not a shoot match. He ended up getting beat in, and he kind of tried some stuff after that, but it never really worked. I never heard that part of it until I read it in your book.
Yeah, well, and so he had tried to become a boxer and was, again, super well hyped, and then lost he got knocked out in whatever it was, 30, 40 seconds. The guy hit him 2 or 3 times and knocked him out. But the guy that did that ends up getting killed by the mob in Chicago. And there's always been some, rumblings. Right. He was killed for double crossing Wayne Munn.
A lot of suspicious things around Wayne Munn.
I think
not that any of them were his fault, but there were a lot of suspicious stuff around him.
Yeah, and I've often wondered, and I don't know why, was Stanislaus Zbyszko ever at risk? Had anybody ever threatened his life for double crossing Wayne Munn? I don't know. If he did, they never talked about it. I don't know. And I don't know how serious it was back then with the gambling and wrestling. I don't know if the gamblers took wrestling as seriously as they did boxing by 1925.
You talk about the famous Rikidozan Kimura fight, when Rikidozan, whatever happened, and, shot on him and knocked him out. He was at risk of being killed by several mafia people.
Yeah, and I think again it gets to this: is it a shoot or is it a work? You know, I mean, because that's pretty darn serious. You know, if those are the consequences. Of
Yeah,
somebody's
those are promoters. Those are the guys that are making money off of it. And so all of a sudden, somebody doesn't adhere to script. You've hurt somebody's business significantly.
Well, that's right. And then even in the old days, they had guys like John Pesek who could go in the ring and hurt you. You know, for sure. If you didn't go along with the script, they would hurt you pretty darn seriously. You
What a
know,
great character Pesek was. I mean, you talk about one of the first
Yeah.
policemen. It was when you're a policeman in that era, you're a bad
Yeah. You're a badass, man.
you're a bad dude. You are a bad dude. If you're policing that group, you're a bad dude.
yeah.
Gotch, Londis, and wow, man, there were some badasses there back there.
Yes,
Well,
there
tell you,
were.
you know, John, one of the intriguing characters also in your book is Gus Sonnenberg,
Oh,
who was
I
a
love this.
5'11", 5'10", whatever he was. Wasn't a giant of a guy, but man, got over. What was his magic, you know?
Yeah, he was one of my favorites. I think I would have, if I could have, I think I would have written a book about him, but I just didn't have enough information on him. But yeah, I mean, so Gus Sonnenberg comes along in about 1928, legitimate football player, you know, has a lot of success in college and in professional football, and is
And on the
brought
championship NFL team, right?
on the Providence Steamroller in 19, I want to say 27, and he was at Dartmouth for a period of time before that in college, and was a very well-known football player and completely legitimate, great football player at a couple different positions. So he gets recruited into wrestling up in Boston. Yeah, from there, they just, again, it's like a Goldberg, you know, it's a totally exactly the same thing where, you know, he's winning these matches in 20, 30 seconds. He just runs the guy over with what they kind of call the flying football tackle. You know, he wins, he goes on.
And he hit it out of anywhere. I saw some YouTube videos of it. It's crazy. It's not like a flying. It's crazy. It kind of just launches himself at any point during the match.
He don't leave his feet, does he?
No, he doesn't. A lot of times
Not
he
too much.
launches himself into a kind of little tackle, but he'll do
Right.
it from almost a kneeling position. I saw he'll do it from all over the
Yeah.
ring. It's actually really entertaining.
It's awesome. No, it's totally awesome.
Yeah.
And I think, and so he slowly builds himself up again, a lot like Wayne Munn. You know, he goes from these like 30 seconds, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and eventually he's able to work a match, you know, a legitimately long match, but he goes on a winning streak of, you know, 42 wins or whatever it is. Eventually he gets a match with Ed Lewis, who was the champion who had reclaimed the championship at the time. And they have these huge matches in Boston Garden that are selling the place out, you know. Eventually Gus wins the heavyweight championship and he goes, you know, around the country. He's drawn 15, 20, 30,000 people in all these big St. Louis, Los Angeles, these huge places. But he has a hell of a time. I mean, at one point he gets attacked on the street by another wrestler who's sort of jealous of him, you know, and it makes the headlines. Poor Gus is knocked unconscious in the, you know, in this legitimate fight. He shows up at the match with like a big black eye. It's embarrassing, you know. And then he just kind of eventually there's an expose in the newspapers that exposes how all his matches are fake and he has to be held accountable to that. And just how the fans turned on him, I think was really interesting to see how he went from sort of the height of fame to
that expose was incredibly well done.
Yeah. So the story is fascinating. And you know, it was one of the big finds for me in the book. And I got that story actually from a memoir of a guy that was the editor for the Atlantic, the magazine, The Atlantic, for a long time. But when he was younger, he was a sports writer for the Boston Globe. And he was hired to interview this woman. And she has had a vendetta against one of the local wrestling promoters. And she actually paid the postal clerks in all these different towns where Gus Sonnenberg would wrestle to send her the placard that advertised Gus Sonnenberg's match. And she was able to match up that they were using the photo. His opponent was basically the same guy with a different name from town to town. So she was able to sort of expose that, and the Boston Herald, it wasn't the Globe, it was the Herald, ran with it. And they wrote a story exposing wrestling. And it really hurt him big time. But he, you know, he ended up losing a lot of money. But if you, in his mind, he, you know, and he says it, he earned every penny he got out there. And that was legitimate what he was doing. And I kind of agree with him. I love Gus Sonnenberg.
I do too. You know, and he was so great on his interviews. He'd be wrestling the same guy he'd wrestled in 20 different towns under 20 different names. And his interview was always great. It was like, he said, I don't know the guy. I don't know what he's bringing to the ring, but I'm just hoping. Yeah, you do know him. This is your 31st time in a row to wrestle him.
That's right. And I don't know if
But
those
it's
were
great.
really...
I love it. I'm not saying that in a bad way. I love it.
I love it too. I don't, I don't know if the sports writers they may have just, for all we know, they might have made those quotes up, and said Gus never met those guys. For all he may have never even met those sports writers. The same way with the after magazines and things like that. We won't know for sure, but I think there's a chance that could happen. But again, in his case, he gets trachoma, which was like his early eye disease that you could get from the dirty mats. And he just talks about, look, these promoters are taking advantage of me every chance they get. So I'm getting as much as I can out of this. And he had no qualms about it. And, he felt like he was putting on a show and it was 100% legitimate. And yeah, I agree with him again, because I think he earned every penny that he got in the business.
Yeah, I do too.
There's a paragraph in your book that I got cracked up at, and little has changed in our business about when the vehicles first came into play. How these guys would sneak out to the outskirts of town and hide out at a little pub or something, and the guy with the car would come and pick them up, and they'd all travel to the town together. I was thinking, man, when I first started in Oklahoma, that's how we did it too. So things really hadn't changed that much in our business.
Hey Jerry, I'm working with Barry Windham one time, and Windham said we're pulling into an arena. It's all got fans everywhere, and there's a security guard there, and we're working against each other. We're riding together. So he goes, "Hey kid, I'll climb into the trunk." I said, "Okay." So,
yeah.
So Barry climbs into the trunk. I pull up the security guard, and you hear Barry hitting the trunk, going, "Help me! Help me! I'm being held hostage! Help me! Help me!"
How big was that trunk, man? Barry Windham was a big guy, man. Yeah. He's one of my favorites. Barry Windham is I love him. I mean, I could watch him over and over. I loved him.
The security guard was just looking at me like, "Sir, is there a problem?" I literally just drove off. I'm like, you know what?
Who won the match?
I don't remember. If it was, I do remember Lanza, where I worked with Barry one time in Cape Girardeau. It may have been that night. I can't remember. And he told me and Barry to go 3 minutes because he wanted to get back to St. Louis. He had some people he wanted to see. So as we go to lock up, Jerry, you remember this match? You remember the show?
Yeah.
Lanza comes flabbing his tie. We hadn't even locked up, and he goes, "Guys, I'm not kidding. I will fire you." And so Barry says, "Duck the lockup, hit me with a clothesline." So that's what we did. We were about 5 seconds.
Barry was. I mean, I remember when
and the whole show that night. That's why Jerry remembers it was about an hour and 15 minutes. If you remember, Jerry.
And I got a call from Vince. Why that show go so short?
They were mad. Jack had a big party back in St. Louis and wanted to get back, and so the whole show ran like an hour and 15 minutes. With Stone Cold was there. Everybody was great. It was great, except when the word got back to Vince.
Yeah.
So
yeah. The business hadn't changed so much, about putting guys and hiding guys out and traveling with them when you're not supposed to travel. That was going on. That's what I find so great about our business. As old as it is, man, there's so much common ground that you have with some of those old timers. Their issues are traveling. Before the automobile, man, they take train rides all across the country. These guys, too, they were. Like you said, Don, they were going from New York to L.A. and making the stops in between. That's what I found too in BALLYHOO too. That I didn't know that the territories were quite as big as they were back in those days, because there were some of these territories, like in the Northeast, these promoters, they had 6-7 towns running a week, which I find really cool. I didn't know that was going on back then.
Oh yeah. I think during different periods when wrestling was really hot, by the early 1930s, I think promoters were opening up everywhere. Wow. And I think in some cases, that's when I think it really became the kind of paramount for these guys to control and have contracts with these wrestlers. And then they would almost be like booking agent talent, kind of like what the business became. They were talent brokers, and they would send the package of wrestlers out to Hartford, Connecticut, to the promoter there, things like that, and they would have their wrestlers travel a circuit of towns. They were the main promoter and they provided the talent, but they worked with these local promoters a lot of the times. By the 30s, I think that the business was pretty set. There's a stretch where I write about when at Danamo Mahoney, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but man, he wrestled like 40 matches in like 43 days or something insane, and an insane amount of miles that he traveled. And you just think every night he got in there for half an hour, 40 minutes, whatever, about guys he may have never met before. and
Yeah.
a new town. And he was from Ireland. He'd never been to America
Yeah.
before.
Rereading that reminded me of my brother's schedule, the NWA champions schedule, because it was just like that. So that kind of brought a relationship from back 50 years ago to where my brother was champion. But what I found too, about BALLYHOO, Jack Curley. I mean, he wasn't only looking for talent in the U.S. He was always looking over in Europe and all that. He'd take those boat rides over and find the carnivals over there and find out who was tough over there and bring them back to the States and put them through the training system.
For sure. And I think that that's where, again, to tie, Yusuf Ismail is, I think, the really beginning of that, of like the foreign terror, like somebody who's really consciously promoted that way. But that carries through right up, especially in the mid-20s. I think it really gets rolling again. And they're matching these football players, these all-American football players, against these big foreign kind of.
What do you think? Do you think of college football, because they were more legit athletes, that they were kind of looking at these college football players to bring them in because they already had a built-up name with the sports writers, and it was easier to get a sports writer to do a story on a Dartmouth Star or Notre Dame Star that would be somebody from Joe Blowville, something like that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think they came in with a lot of built-in publicity from being college football stars. I mean, back then, college football was much bigger than.
It's huge, then, right?
Yeah, it was huge. So these guys came in with names, and that's when you see one college football player after another coming in to professional wrestling. But to jump back to the importing of these European wrestlers, I think at the time too, it was, you had a Greek champion, an Italian champion, a champion for every little enclave of a city, right, that could have their kind of groups of immigrants that had moved there. So I think he was working with Jack Pfeffer, who we haven't really talked about yet, but that was where I think Pfeffer's came, and that's how he got to be so powerful, was he really knew how to work the immigration system to get these guys into the country so that they could appear here and work here for 6 months or a year. And it was not easy to do back then at all. That was not easy to get to work that immigration system.
One thing.
Yeah, but they must have had an end with them. Curley must have had somebody give them a golden handshake there to bring them in, because they were bringing them in by the boatload back there too.
I suspect so. And then they made a big deal when the guys would get off the boats. They'd have reporters there to take pictures of them and stuff like that. You see that in boxing too.
Yeah, and the Midwest, the wrestling was so huge in the Midwest, and you kind of, the population's in the East, but you think the immigrants, that were taken out to the Midwest were the original wrestlers. They were from lands, countries that were fighters and stuff like that. So that's really, I think the Midwest grew so much better than other parts of the country.
People may have never even seen, in some cases, a guy like Ivan Podobny. He was like a big Russian with a big curly Q mustache and a big dude. And I mean, he was legitimately a professional wrestler over in Russia. And so I think when he traveled around, it was a real, it bordered that line of sort of like, they called them exotics, because people had really never seen somebody that physically just looked like that, I think, in some cases. So yeah, that was a big part of Curley's business for sure in the 20s.
One thing I noticed in your book was in the 1930s, when Londos got really hot after Gus Sonnenberg and the Depression, Londos gets really hot, and everybody's wanting to be a wrestler. Bronco Nagurski comes in to be a wrestler. You've got Primo Carnera's wrestling, making more money wrestling than he was boxing as heavyweight champion. It's similar to it seems to me similar to what it is today. When you see boom times in wrestling, which it comes and goes, and right now maybe the biggest boom ever. But nowadays you're starting to see guys wanting to come in from all different types of walk of life. That's very similar to what you saw it looked like in the 1930s, because wrestling was so big.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the for a long period of time, that the Londos period, his run from about 1930 to 1932, 33, and there was like the golden age, really before television. It was when, they were filling Madison Square Garden, not just Madison, but all the big arenas. They would travel. Londos was on a train constantly performing night after night after night. It made a lot of money. I mean, and one of the ways you can kind of sort of separate the guys that were making up stories about how much money they made and the guys that weren't, is you see like Londos owned tons of farmland. Frank Gotch owned tons of farmland, but before his death, he was like a bank president or something, so they moved into legitimate careers, legitimate in quotation, but and they had a lot of money. So these guys were really making quite a lot of money. So And I think Curley even talks about this, and he understood this, I think, better than a lot of people, is that wrestling moves in cycles, because he'd seen it happen and he knew it's like you're going to burn it out after a couple of years. You just ride the wave while you can. And then when it sort of plateaus for a period of time, you move into the smaller arenas, you run it as sort of a smaller thing, but then you slowly, it'll come back. And he always knew, he never gave up, I think, in his life. Even when he died, he was planning to bring it back by the end of the 1930s if he could.
But isn't that attractions though more than it cycles? I mean, I've always heard people say, "Oh, wrestling always goes in cycles," and I just don't think I'm not sure I believe that. You know, it's you have one Jimlondos. You've got nobody else like that guy, and when he goes away, for whatever reason, he gets old, he quits wrestling as much, he gets tired. You're going to have a fall off because you don't have another Jimlondos, and you put everything on Jimlondos during that time because everybody makes a ton of money. You got one Stone Cold, and then after that, you have a drop off. You know, so to me, is it necessarily cycles in the business, or is it just attractions?
I don't, that's a good question. One thing I would think about, because I'm really interested in the early 80s, in wrestling, people put a lot of, WrestleMania and Hulk Hogan and all this stuff, but 1983 was one of the biggest years. And I mean, wrestling was humongous in 1983. And I'm not sure like who the main I think there were a lot of little attractions around that it added up into a big business, but just wrestling was popular from my memory. Wrestling was really moving into the mainstream in that time, and it was on people's mind. And then Hulk Hogan kind of came along and they were able to take advantage of that and push it to sort of another level. So I'm not sure if it is I think it's probably usually attraction based, but I don't know. Sometimes maybe you just get enough small attractions together and that adds up to something bigger. I'm not sure.
It's just interesting, because like after the Hogan era, you had that fall off. You didn't have Tommy Rich in the Carolinas. You didn't have a lot of things. Ricky and Robert weren't there anymore. So you may be right. It may be a amalgamation of several different things. It just seems like, because you put so much emphasis on one person when they're hot for good reason, that when that person does whatever happened, they get hurt, they get retired, they start slowing down. There's a natural fall off until you find another person, because it's, people used to always say, we need 20 Shawn Michaels. We didn't have 20 then. We had one. And it's hard to find these guys that are that much better than everybody else that you can put the whole company on.
John, as a promoter, the way I see it, it is a cycle, because when you get somebody, let's just say like with Tommy Rich, you put all your efforts into Tommy Rich. You're not building anything, and that was a different deal. Like when the Attitude Era come along, because not only were we building Stone Cold, and we were building so many other guys underneath that when they kind of stepped aside, you had somebody step in it inside there. But when we were building like Tommy or Dusty or Flair, there wasn't a lot of other guys that we were paying attention to and building. They were getting, like that semi main build, but they weren't getting that build until we got through with Tommy or Dusty or Rick, one of those guys. Then one of the guys underneath will get that opportunity to go. So, and then it takes some time to build that guy. So to me, it is a cycle until you cycle a new guy in to get over.
Yeah, I mean, Jack Curley, and this is something that I've always been interested in, is like, in the old days when Frank Gotch was wrestling, you had one match. You'd go to see Frank Gotch. Yeah. That was it. You'd go there and
that's
that was
it. Yeah. Night. What were the preliminaries like? Were they just a bunch of local guys that were trying to get a name, or what would that? Because we're never ready to talk about the undercard on these huge shows that you.
I'm not sure there was a huge undercard. Like, I think it may have been other.
Were there other matches? Were there other matches plus others, or what?
I think maybe. I mean, there's other guys that are going to know some of this a little better than I will, but I don't think so. I think there was like maybe one match, and you might have had other forms of entertainment throughout the night that led up to the wrestling match that was sort of the headlining thing. But I think at a certain point, when they're having full cards, which is what we're used to now. You get 8, 9, 10, 11 matches. I mean, when I was going in the 80s, I think, you'd go and you'd expect to see 8 or 9 matches. Yeah, but there's like a rhythm that's created throughout the night that by the time you get to the main event, you're so keyed up for it and ready to see it. And, you've seen different kinds of matches. Some are fast, some are slow, some are goofy, but by the time you get to the main event, you're ready and you're primed for it. So
you're ready.
Yeah, and I've always been interested in how promoters pace the evening, like a 3 or 4 or 5 hour night of wrestling, how you pace that. I think that's neat. And people that are going to be sitting there for a long time, and you don't want to lose them. So, but again, I think that was happening by the beginning of the Londos era. You'd have 7 or 8 matches on a card, and that's also more ways to split the money, which I think is a little tricky for people. You know,
And then speaking of splitting the money, you're reading some of the guarantees, 100,000 6 figures back in the 30s and 40s and the 20s. I mean, 6 figures back in then are high 7 figures nowadays. So these guys, they were making some serious jack back in the day.
some of them were. I don't know. You never know how much of that ended up in their pockets. But when you look at the ledger books, like if anybody gets the chance, I really recommend it. But going to Notre Dame, they actually have the ledger books that for some of those nights, and the guys were getting $5, $15, on a full card. But Londos always got a lot of money, but the undercard guys not quite so much.
Well, back in the '60s, I know when Jack started in '65, I during the summertime, I was in charge of the driving the ring truck around, and Bob Clay and Clay brothers were associates of Leroy's, and they would put me in charge of the box office. I'd sell the box office, and they'd take, okay, there's 30% here, and that goes for the talent. The rest of it goes in my pocket, in other words. But 30%, take that aside, and then I would watch him put Danny Hodge $200 or $300, and this other guy, maybe $30. Then an opener, $10-15, and he made the same damn trip. Holy shit! I know which side I want to be on. I want to be on that 70% side. I want to be on the 30% side.
I think Toots Mont made the same, and I write about that a little bit. I think he became such a powerful promoter. I think he did the same kind of math in his head. Like, this doesn't quite make that much sense to be here busting my ass.
That's right.
When I read that reminded me of my experience there. I'm sitting in somewhere like this little town in Arkansas, and it's probably 115 degrees, and I'm selling tickets. All of a sudden, this new Cadillac pulls up, and it's back when they had the rolling windage, power windows just come out. This guy rolled down power wind, and I could feel that blast of air conditioning hit me in the face. Hey, kid, I need 7 tickets. Well, okay, but I need front row tickets. I don't have front row tickets. And he said, come out here and talk to me. I said, I can't leave the box office. It was Bob Clay, the promoter, testing me if I'd leave the box office. I'd go out and talk to him. And holy shit, man, that must be nice. Pulled up in a Cadillac with air conditioning, because I didn't have any air conditioning cars. But that's how the promoters were.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm interested in this too, as how the wrestling business kind of changed. It was an all cash business, and it was,
exactly.
I mean, nobody could count, and they would double sell tickets, and they would do all kind of.
No, everybody could count.
To this day, if I mentioned to my accountant that I got paid in cash, he said, "You didn't tell me that."
Yeah, I mean, everything was cash, and eventually that changes in the '80s with electronic ticketing and stuff like that. But yeah. So
darn it.
Hey, the most valuable guy when I got into WWE was Arnie Scollin and Tim White, because when they had to deal with cash, they knew every trick in the book, and they did not let anybody stiff Vince. Those were 2 of the most valuable guys in the company. You could not fool those 2 guys. They had seen everything.
I mean, I think too, and you think about these wrestlers traveling around with huge wads of cash. I mean, no wonder guys carried guns, and I probably would too.
Hey, the guy on this podcast, not me, and obviously not you, flew back from Japan with $250,000 strapped to his carcass.
About 125. My brother had the other 125. But we're talking to Thunderbolt Patterson. Thunderbolt, back in his early days, he would keep his wad in his boots and keep a derringer there right beside it too. So he had a two-shot derringer that he had right next to his cash wad, his payoff wad, when he would wrestle. But let's get back to your book, BALLYHOO. The West Coast. I mean, we hear about the East Coast doing all these big, huge houses. How was LA and the West Coast at the time, and what happened in Seattle that kind of threw wrestling behind there for years and years?
Well, so it kind of Los Angeles really, I think, picks up. There's people who are kind of really steeped in this, but it picks up. Lou Darrow is the famous promoter out there. He was in the late 10s, he was involved in the big Greco-Roman international tournament that I write about,
Right.
in Manhattan in 1916. But eventually he moves out. The next wrestler moves out to Los Angeles and sets up shop out there. And yeah, I mean, by the 20s, I mean, they're drawing huge crowds out there. Ed Lewis is drawing, sellout shows and things like that. And he ran that business up into his death until the early 1940s, I think, when he died, and kind of established the empire out there. And then after he dies is when I think the Eatons move in, and they move into, and then some of the different promoters then that ran Los Angeles after him. What killed Seattle, from at least in the era that I'm writing about, was the Mabray gang. Kind of that whole thing we talked about before with gambling, and in the 1908, 1909. But before then, and there's books you can read about this, but the Pacific Northwest was one of the hottest areas around, largely during the Frank Gotch era. I mean, they worked that circuit, and there's a promoter who was really was responsible for some of that, named Joe Marsh, who shows up in the book, and he's really almost like a predecessor to Curley. He's one of the first, I think, him and like Farmer Burns and names like that, guys that really kind of understood how you could build up wrestling in a territory, and get a crowd week after week after week. And they were doing that up in the Seattle area, and Frank Gotch was one of their main attractions. But I think the gambling and stuff kind of burned that out by about 1908. And Seattle's, it's dicey. It never didn't seem to recover until the Owens came along in Portland, and they were promoting down there. And then, by the 70s, Portland was huge, and those guys would work that circuit up into Seattle, and then I think jump off to Hawaii and things like that up there.
Yeah. Portland was huge, but Seattle never seemed like it got the same respect as Portland.
Yeah, I don't know why. I think that, so my understanding is that Don Owen and his family that ran wrestling in Portland, they sort of controlled Seattle, but it was almost like a satellite city for them, and there was promoters. Right. It was sort of dicey. I almost think they worked more like in Southern Washington. From what I've understood, that was always kind of a short run. That's why people liked it. You could go, 2 hours. You could be in, Southern Washington. You could go down to Eugene, and you could work a lot of those towns on an hour and a half drive. And a lot of those Buddy Rose and those guys set up shop and lived in Portland their whole lives.
Right.
Yeah.
How did the coast work together? As far, especially I'm talking about when John Marsh was there, you're talking about Frank Gotch working up in Seattle and things. You still have big crowds out in New York and territories, not necessarily territories, but big matches out in New York. Was there much working together, or was everything so far apart back then before the train was that great and everything that it just kind of lived as separate countries almost?
That's a good question. I don't think so, because I think in the early 1910s, 1915, 1916, 17, you'll see like Jack Curley travels out to San Francisco with Vladik Zbyszko, and they have some big matches out there, and Ed Lewis is out there, and they would work it in that area. And I think Dick Schickett actually trained out there when he came to America. I think he started in San Francisco. So there was always kind of wrestling there. It just didn't, my understanding and my feeling is it just didn't really get totally organized until like the 30s and 40s. And you had some of the different promoters who kind of set up shop there and kind of made it more permanent. And Roy Shire eventually obviously kind of takes it over. And I think it worked somewhat similarly down in Los Angeles again, until Lou Darrow kind of took it over and really organized it down there. And he had a circuit too that would run through Southern California. I suspect that because usually, again, because there was just the one world champion for a period of time, they would, he would travel out to California and perform out there. So I get the sense they worked together, but I get the sense that Curley and those guys were kind of in control and sort of dictated a little bit. But eventually you see like Billy Sandow moves and sets up shop down there. So I think by the 20s, they were really starting to concentrate a lot more heavily on Los Angeles. But again, I still think it was still the New York guys that kind of dictated a lot of it. And that's where because they controlled a lot of the media, I think that's partially why they had and again, you see that again in the 80s, but Londos by the 30s, he was in every legitimate magazine, Life and the New Yorker and the New York Times. Everybody wrote about him, but it's because I think he was so popular in New York.
Yeah, and the Atlantic that was considered one of the top magazines at the time. It was all over that all the time too, right?
Yeah, and they wrote about him seriously. They did not write about him as like a circus
guy.
No, yeah, I mean, they wrote about him legitimately, and they weren't always convinced the matches were 100% real, but they did not write about him as he
Which is pretty unusual because that was during a time of Jim Crow laws, of segregation, of anti-immigrant sentiment, and he was as big a name as Babe Ruth during that time.
Yeah, for sure. You know, and if anybody's interested, I did a long piece. So a little during the while I was writing this book, I would research different tangents and kind of write articles about some of the different tangents that I was finding that it don't end up in the book. But I did do a long piece on Reginald Seekey, who was really the first major black wrestler. And, you know, he was wrestling in the early 1920s. I write about him a little bit in the book, but if anybody wants more detail, if you go to Greg Oliver's Slam Wrestling, there's a long piece on Seekey there.
What you had about him in the book, I'm sorry, I meant to cut you off. What you had
Oh,
what you had about him in the book was incredibly interesting. It was really interesting.
Yeah, it was.
About Seekey.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's again one of those interesting things about wrestling is I think when a lot of other sports were segregated again, they had resegregated. Wrestling had black performers, you know, and Seekey was a big star for a period of time. He eventually went to Europe, but he doesn't get a lot of credit for, I think, how groundbreaking he really was. He was wrestling in main event matches. He never got, from my memory, he never got a title shot because they wouldn't give him, the champion wouldn't wrestle against him, but he was working in the main events. He was very well known for a long time.
It's such an.
Just speaking of that, were the crowds very integrated back in those times, or were they just all segregated crowds?
I think they were segregated. You know, I'm not 100% sure. Somebody can correct me on that. I kind of think they were segregated. I'm pretty sure. Pretty sure that would have been in most cities. But I'm willing to be wrong about that. I'm not 100% sure about that.
Yeah, you know, because famously Sputnik Monroe, you know, not you know, sometimes the South is a little bit further behind than the rest of the world, you know, but Sputnik Monroe famously integrated a lot of the wrestling in Memphis because of saying that he wanted people to have equal seating.
Yeah,
you know.
I certainly think it's interesting, and not to get too far a tangent here, but I make this as sort of a footnote in the book that, you know, it did take wrestling until about when Ron Simmons won the heavyweight champion in 1990. I mean, that's kind of a long time.
It is.
Sort of name a heavyweight. You can
it is
sort of a long time. I wonder what that has to say, you know, about what some of the promoters thought. You know, I'm not sure.
Right.
But
yeah.
Well, off the record, I can tell you what a prominent promoter in Atlanta thought about it.
Yeah. So
we'll talk about that.
You know, Seekey and those guys did not have an easy road. That was not easy for them for what they did.
Yeah. And there you got to give guys credit like Bill Watts and those guys that took that step, and even Jim Crockett Sr. to some extent when he made Thunderbolt Patterson the first tag team champions and mixed racial tag team champions in Carolina. So that's a bold move on the promoter's deal. And you know, the Seekey guy, man, he was, I guess, from what you write, he was a tremendous athlete outside the wrestling business too.
Apparently, yeah. I mean, and he was popular for a long time, and he makes his way back. Eventually, he's actually, believe it or not, he's one of Gorgeous George's first opponents. He loses on TV to Gorgeous George. Or I don't know if that actually.
Oh yeah.
But he loses to Gorgeous George right when Gorgeous George was right on his early run. So he managed to. I mean, Seekey rebuilt his career a couple times, and his story is endlessly. I mean, he was a prisoner of war during World War II. He was captured by the Germans and was held as a prisoner of war for a long period of time. He survived that. He came back to America, rebuilt his career in Ohio, moved out to Los Angeles, and was a star there for a long period of time. I think he dies in 1946, really unexpectedly. But his life that's a book. Somebody will eventually write a book about him, and he's a fascinating figure, for sure.
In the book that you wrote, the time frame that you wrote, like let's talk about Londos, Gotch, Farmer Burns. You know, real quick before we go into that, Farmer Burns, he trained Gotch, right? I mean, tell me just a little bit. You wrote about him in the book. It's such an interesting character. There's still stuff out there, Farmer Burns training manual, which is actually pretty cool. It's he was famously he would let you could be hung by his neck and not he was an amazing guy.
You love, yeah. He would do the hangman's. I'm not sure if that was a trick or what that was all about. I'm pretty sure those ropes were gimmicks somehow. But yeah, I mean, he did train Frank Gotch. Though I also think Ole Marsh had a big hand in training Gotch. I'm pretty sure. But Burns was one of the early really, I think, a promoter. I mean, he started as legitimate wrestler. I mean, I'm sure dead dangerous wrestler, and would travel from town to town and do these elaborate gambling schemes where he would sort of be like pretend to be a dishwasher or something like that. And, he'd challenge people to matches, and eventually they'd build it up where they'd get people to put all this money down. It turns out, he's this great champion wrestler that could beat anybody who gets, who he gets his hands on. So a dangerous way to make a living, and again, I think it ties into this work shoot thing. Like the consequences of him being found out were probably pretty serious as he kind of ran out of town with all this money, Eventually, I think he goes legitimate. And starts working with Burns on Frank Gotch on promoting these gigantic matches. I think he sees dollar signs for sure when he probably meets Frank Gotch,
But he had to be such a visionary too. I mean, wasn't anything, and all of a sudden he's writing a correspondence course. He has a correspondence course on how to become a professional wrestler. I mean, that's so far ahead of anybody's time on doing stuff like that. Yeah. It's just as intelligent. He had to be a very, very right guy to do something like
that. I definitely think so. And again, I mean, that's what I hope I bring out in the book is just the lives these guys lived, and there's a story at the end in the epilogue where Burns used to go to the wrestling matches, when he was an old man, and he would get people to choke him. And his gimmick, that wasn't a gimmick because it was kind of real, but he would talk and talk and talk, and you would try to cut off his ability to talk, and he was an old man showing up backstage doing this.
That damn old man streak. I still hate that Brisco has it because I'm still waiting for him to get old enough where I can beat him up.
Well, and the story I write in the epilogue too is that great story about Joester where he was in the he was in a veterans hospital for a mental condition for most of his life. He was most of his adult life. He was institutionalized once his career was over, but where a bunch of wrestlers show up, including Luthez, and they try to wrestle him. And according to Luthez, Joester took them all.
Turn back the clock. That was a great story. I'd love to read that story in your book. That all of a sudden this old guy who's just kind of a little dementia and all this stuff turned back the clock and stretched all the kids.
Yeah, I love that story. I love it.
Yeah. When I was a kid breaking in a.
One other thing before we go, you mentioned Jack Pfeffer, and I know he's one of the old guys from the 1890s that Mr. Brisco wrestled with back in around 1920. He's actually not from the 1890s, but Mr. Brisco did know Jack Pfeffer, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
The first thing,
and Ed Strangler Lewis. I was just going to tell a story about meeting Ed Strangler Lewis there, but go ahead about Jack Pfeffer.
Well, I was going to say that one of the first things you said when John got on the call was that you want to talk to him about Jack Pfeffer because you had met Jack Pfeffer and was. I didn't know he was this little short Napoleon guy. I don't know if he's Napoleon or not. Anybody who's just short and in charge, you call him Napoleon, whether they are or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. When I was a kid breaking into business, Jack got, I don't know if you ever heard that, he was one of Leroy's trusted guys. He was an old-time wrestler from the 30s and 40s. He was a referee, of course, and Leroy made a lot of those guys referees. And he was a friend with Ed Strangler Lewis. Ed was at a veterans hospital in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And during that time, I was just breaking into business, about 60, 65, when Jack was just breaking into business. So I like I said, I do a lot of road trips with the guys setting up the rings and everything. So one day Jack got me and Daddy Hot and said, guys, we're going to leave a little bit early today. We're going to go by and meet Ed Lewis. I said, Ed the Strangler Lewis? Yeah. So we go in there, there's this old guy. I mean, he's close to death at that time. I think he died about a year later, but he was close to death then. And so going in there, I said, Danny, I'm going to put a headlock on him. Would you count him out if he goes down? And Danny, kid, if I was you, I wouldn't touch that old man. He got that streak just like we were talking about earlier. So I didn't dare touch him, man. But, it was tempting there, but I actually got to meet him about a year before he passed away.
You know what? You see what the problem I have here, John? And Mr. Brisco meets this incredible legend. It's not like, hey, I get to meet Ed Strangler Lewis. He goes, I can put a headlock on the old bastard. That's what he's thinking.
Right. And I think too, it's like, but you couldn't. I wouldn't,
How bad are old wrestlers that, hey, he's in his hospital bed. I'll put a headlock on him.
Oh, man,
I'll put a headlock and choke him out, man. If he goes down, count him out, Daddy. And then, don't do it.
He'd have probably loved it though. But I mean, Jack Pfeffer, he's a again, another guy that's kind of a book unto himself. But yeah, Pfeffer's obviously famous for creating these larger than life characters, you know, these outrageous guys. They would wear, you know, leopard skin tights, or, you know, they would, you know, all kind of outrageous things, and give them outrageous nicknames, and you know, mustaches were like famous back then and things like that. And yeah, I mean, he just really pushed the boundaries of, I think, the wilder side of wrestling, where you were getting away from like a guy in tights with no shirt on, you know what I mean? But we see that again. I think those combinations, going all again back to Yusuf Ismail, a character, obviously somebody like the Iron Sheik or Nikolai Volk. I mean, you know, guys that we took really seriously, you know, as wrestlers. They weren't comedian, they weren't comic, but they were also kind of larger than life in this way. But we took them really seriously. But Pfeffer really had a hand, and if he didn't invent it, he really, I think, wrote the book on how to do it well. And again, we see it over and over and over. And eventually he worked with guys like Buddy Rogers and some really humongous names that he helped get started in the business, who went on to obviously really big things, but he had a hand in all that.
And he was cycled in and out of the business several times. He was blackballed there in New York. He couldn't get in to promote New York or Madison Square Garden. Then he had to wait a year or two. Then Muldoon, when Muldoon lost his job there or whatever it was, he was put back in the Madison Square Garden. And still, and then he had a part of promoting one of his last really big match that didn't turn out that big. What was that?
Which the last Shaq Pfeffer match in New York. I mean, really, yeah. I think what was happening at that time is everybody was fighting for control of access to the arenas. So he was convinced he was going to be able to take over the lease in Madison Square Garden. This is again after the Dick Schickett match, and so they this is in 1937. You know, Pfeffer's really gone against the kind of powers that being pro wrestling is trying to start up as an independent. And he brings Dick Schickett into New York, Madison Square Garden, to lose his heavyweight championship to a wrestler named Ali Baba, who was going to be the next guy to kind of carry things forward. But, you know, they end up drawing 2,000 people, whatever it is, to Madison Square Garden again, because I think wrestling, people were just so burned out on it. It had run its course. It had been kind of made fun of in the press, all this stuff. So that was kind of...
And that happened. The press kind of died out when Curley died, right?
Right. And this was just a little bit before that. But I mean, what's really interesting about that story, again, this is again with wrestling. It's like, you can't make this stuff up, man. You know, Dick Schickett wrestles this match in Madison Square Garden, loses to, you know, it's a disappointing night. Nobody comes. And that same night, his wife dies in a car accident. You know, this is after he's double crossed, you know, all these really powerful guys. And there's still rumors around, like, well, did the promoters have anything to do with his wife dying in the car accident? But I mean, probably not. It was just a coincidence. But you're just like, you couldn't write this, and you try to imagine, like, what's going through this poor guy's head. You know, he's off in another city, he has to go home and, you know, be next to his wife. He's being sued by these promoters in federal court. You know, it's just what a nightmare. You know, his whole life kind of went off the rails because of this one decision that he made. And it's an unbelievable story, and I feel like it hadn't really been told, and I feel like it hadn't maybe gotten as much attention as I feel like it deserved, because that time was just crazy, and there's just so many interesting people and so many interesting storylines, and I hope I did it justice. So,
what were some of the names? What were some of the names that he come up, like Bobo Brazil, but it was Hobo Brazil or something like that, right?
Jack Pfeffer, that's what he's sort of famous for nowadays, is running these spin-off guys, right? That he would change one name. There was Luquez, I think, and all of these.
Yeah,
that's great. That's great.
That's right. Trying to confuse people, but he's a character. They never drove him out of business. You know, he was promoting wrestling till the day pretty much that he ended up having to go in a nursing home. But yeah, he's an endlessly interesting figure.
John, this book, Ballyhoo, to me, Jerry was, when he told me about it, he was 100% right. I couldn't put it down. It's one of the best page turner. It's a must read for any wrestling fan, for history fan, for entertainment fan, for absolutely everything. What was so in all this time, this 60 years basically that you covered, what was the big takeaway that you got from this? What was the thing you learned? What was the thing that you took away the most, that this is something that I realized that maybe you didn't realize before, maybe you realized and this reinforced it?
Oh, geez. Good question. You know, I think that I struggled for a long time when I was writing this, of how much detail to go into on, like, was it real or was it not? Was this match a work or was it not? And it was easy to get real lost in this vortex of trying to figure out Was it fake? Was it not? And I think at a certain point, I just got comfortable with just throwing that out, whether it mattered or not. It just, to me, it just stopped mattering whether it was real. And I was willing to sort of believe and go with it as long as you could back it up with facts. I really wanted to put this in the words of the guys that lived it. And that's why I tried to fill it with so many kind of quotes. I always wanted to make it like an oral history, that if you could do it, where you let these guys tell the story themselves. And I really wanted to put it in the voice of the people that lived it and not judge it too much from, you know, our perspective nowadays. So I think that was maybe one thing I learned, was that it just stopped mattering to me if it was, you know, if the match was legitimate or not. And I just tried to really put it in the get in the skin of the guys that were performing, and as much as I could, really the people that came out to watch it. What was it that they were enjoying about it? What was it that they got out of it? And what was the context that was around them so they could really enjoy it? And just what were the lives these guys lived? And that's where I tried not to judge them too hard, and I tried not to put too much of my own sort of opinions on them, and just really dig into like what were the lives they lived, and what drove them, what circumstances kind of drove them to where they ended up, and what they were doing, and what would it have been like to get to do that. You know, how cool would that have been?
Yeah.
You know, so that's where I feel like I landed, and I stopped trying to put my own take on it as much. You know what I mean?
Well, you hit a home run with it, my friend. Congratulations. It's a very entertaining book. Tell us how BALLYHOO, the name BALLYHOO, where did BALLYHOO come from? I mean, we all know BALLYHOO, you get out and move it. But tell us where the origination from.
Yeah, I mean, from my research, it was in the carnivals, the Bally was the thing they would stand on, you know, and they would try to get you to come into the tent, you know, to pay 10 cents to see, you know, the two-headed woman, or to see this wrestling match, or to see whatever, the bearded lady, you know, and that was the BALLYHOO. And I think that exposure to that in the carnival years, and Jack Curley's instrumental in this, because he was exposed to all that stuff as a young kid when he was working at the World Fairs and things like that. He got exposed to that world, and I think they carried that into the wrestling world. And I think, unlike any other sport, wrestling is like a carnival. It's like the circus. It's like this traveling show in a lot of ways. And I think that those guys, they created that, I think.
And Jerry, that's what
great. You mentioned a married couple that worked at Carnival there, that came on to be pretty prominent people there. I actually have a poster of them standing out front of a Carnival tent, you know, with their names on it and everything. And when I was reading it, then I think I got a poster of that couple in my photograph collection. I'm trying to find it so I can send it. I haven't been able to find it yet, but
it's great. I mean, that life was fascinating. I mean, if you watch like the original, some of those old movies, there's a great old one, the original Nightmare Alley. They remade it, but the original Nightmare Alley, and especially if you read the book, man, about life in a carnival, it's great. You know, I love that stuff. I think it's fascinating. You know.
And Jerry, the opening pyro was always called BALLYHOO, right? At the
BALLYHOO, yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that. Really? Oh,
opening BALLYHOO. Yeah. We get the list of what's coming out, and opening.
And always at BALLYHOO on the run sheet. BALLYHOO, which is
that was the opening pyro and the big opening of the show.
Gets you fired up, you know.
It was BALLYHOO.
Oh. Wow, I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Hey, it's funny you mentioned carnivals. I know you got to go. I went to a carnival one time, and I was working over in Europe, and I had a carnival there, and I had the animals back, you know, behind the where all the guys were living. So you want to go see some of the animals? I said, yeah, I'd love to. So I go back there, and the guys were talking carny about me. Like, guys, what? They weren't saying anything bad. They're just saying this is a big dude. That's what they were saying. They're telling me, saying it in carny. And
did you speak back to them?
Of course I did. I let them talk for a while to see what they're going to say about me. And they weren't saying anything bad at all. They're just talking about me. And that was it, but nothing bad. And I answered them. They just looked at me. I go, where do you think we came from?
You know, I've got a question for you guys. I'm really curious. Is the word kayfabe, because I tried not to use the word kayfabe in the book, because I just didn't think it wasn't a word, I don't think, that was used back then. But was that a word that was used in the 70s? Did people really say that to each other?
It was a word that was used in the 60s when I broke into business. I mean, kayfabe. I mean, that was the main word you learned in the business with kayfabe.
But it's used differently now.
And I don't know where it came from myself, but I remember all those old timers, like I mentioned, Jack Gott, Leo Voss, and Larry Tillman, some of those old workers for Leroy that became referees. they're the ones that broke me in, taught me terminology of the business and kayfabe, and that was one of the biggest. What you be kayfabe? Don't you got to be talking in a restaurant? Watch your kayfabe in a restaurant, kid, stuff like that.
Wow.
That's
Okay.
how it was always used back then. It's used differently now. Words have different meanings as, time progresses, but the way they use it now is not how it was used 30 years ago.
Yeah, and I couldn't even find when they first started using it. Like, I seriously doubt my sense is they didn't use that word back in the 10s and 20s and 30s. I don't know when they started, but again, I think, yeah, this idea of just the secret, the society that they felt like they kind of needed to keep secret from everybody. I kind of feel like maybe that started in the 40s after
And
wrestling.
you use the term in your book too that kind of got from shooter to policeman. Policeman that we called policeman back in the early days, right?
Yeah. Oh,
The
yeah.
guy,
Yeah. That was a term that
he
was.
was a policeman. He'd come in and take care of everything, right?
Yeah, he was the guy you didn't want to run
You didn't
afoul.
want to cross. You didn't want to cross the police.
That's exactly right.
Same way when I broke in, you didn't want to cross it.
And every promotion had one. They all had.
Every promotion in my time had one or two, maybe even three of them. Eddie had a dozen of them down here.
Yeah, and there's no business like it. I mean, there really isn't a business like it. And so again, I kind of felt like the story that it hadn't quite been told of where this thing came from, and I just hope I got it somewhat right. You
got it right. Is there anything, John, that you feel that we neglected to talk about that we can bring up? Because we jumped all over, and we thank you for sending the cliff notes to us, kind of giving us an outline how to follow this thing.
Which we didn't follow at all because
we didn't follow it. Then
we were too excited to talk.
I did the best I could.
I had my scribble page too that I can't read after I wrote this damn thing out. I'd be reading it, so man, I got to write that down and reference that.
The reason John is because he's from Oklahoma and he can't write.
That's true, but is there anything we left out that we should be before we go that we want to cover?
I mean, I'll just say, I hope that I think if people pick it up and read it, I hope it's fun. I really wanted to make it an entertaining read. There's stuff I felt like I maybe had to leave out because maybe it detracted too much from the main storyline, and it could, I could have written a 600-page book. There's more, but I really felt like I wanted to make this a fun, engaging read that people could kind of get through from beginning to end. But that it would be, it would like I said before, it would ring true to wrestlers, it would ring true to historians, ring true to casual fans, ring true to sports fans, and that there's enough in there for everybody while staying true to this kind of strange world that we all love, So I just hope I accomplished that, and I hope if people give it a chance and pick it up that they have a good time reading it.
Well, you certainly did. In your research, I know I keep at this last question, but in your research, did you find anything that, man, I can't put this in there? It's good, but I just can't put it in there.
Well, I did try to stay away from stories that were maybe too outrageous. I mean, people always
such as.
Well, I don't know if I can think of a good one off the top of my head, but there's some stuff about Jack Pfeffer would be an example people always talk about. Like, kind of, there are a lot of stories you read about him. I'm not sure how much of that stuff was real and how much of it might have had some anti-Semitic undertones to it. Like, I just didn't know. So I left some of that stuff out there. I didn't quite dig as deeply into some of that stuff as I think I could have. But you hear a lot of stories. Wrestling fans love to tell stories of what these ribs and things like that. I tried to stay away from some of that stuff. To me, I'm not sure how true all of it is. Some of it I kind of think there's some.
Were there ribs back in those days?
I think there probably were. I think that some of those guys you might not wanted to have ribbed. I mean, I think they were.
Especially the policeman.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not sure you would have pulled a rib on John Pesek, or you'd have really paid for it. But,
you mentioned Wally Dusek in there. The Dusek brothers. That's a story in itself. That's a whole book there. Rudy and Wally and all those Dusek brothers. Man, what a tough ass family that was.
For sure. And again, I couldn't cover everybody that I think I deserved a spot. So if I left somebody out of there, it doesn't mean that I don't think they deserve to be included. It maybe just meant I found a way I couldn't fit them in somehow to the story. But there's other books out there that do talk about those guys. So I hope it's a complete enough story. And I think I tried to hit as many of the really big important names as I could. Who for me would be like kind of a Hall of Fame of that era. Not all those guys get any recognition at all anymore. But yeah, there's still a lot more I'm sure that could be told, and people will do it. There'll be, like I said, there's a biography of William Muldoon coming. There's a biography of Jack Pfeffer, and I'm sure some of those will fill in some of the blanks too. For
Good.
Sure.
Well, John, thank you very much. The book is Ballyhoo, and as Mr. Briscoe said, it's a must read for any wrestling fans. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you guys. Thanks for your time.